task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Report. Content warning. Report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence. Segregated schools persist as of the early 2000s and through today. The vast majority of black children remain locked into schools separate from their white peers, and possibly more unequal than the schools that their grandparents had attended under legal segregation. 83 The U.S. Government Accountability Office found that, 60 years after Brown versus Board of Education, black students are increasingly attending segregated, high-poverty schools where they face multiple educational disparities. 184 The U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights data between 2014 through 2018 shows the same disparities, large and persistent opportunity gaps, and fewer education resources for black students. 185 Black students are less likely to attend schools that offer advanced coursework in math and science courses, 186 and less likely to be placed in gifted and talented programs. Another found that black students had been on an accelerated math track consistent with their white and Asian peers were disproportionately removed from the track, so that in high school they were no longer being placed with the highest achievers, thereby reinforcing racial inequality. 187 Black students are also more likely to attend schools with large class sizes and teachers with the least amount of experience and qualifications, and that employ law enforcement officers but no counselors. 188 This can partially be attributed to the fact that urban school districts oftentimes have difficulty attracting and retaining teachers due to the low pay, substandard working conditions, and socioeconomic factors that affect such work environments. 189 Moreover, although many African American students deal with greater social and environmental pressures, schools mostly attended by African Americans fail to place greater emphasis on family counseling and community empowerment. 190 Because black students more often have less qualified teachers than their white peers, they fall behind in school, and some researchers believe this is one reason for their excess placement in classes that support students with disabilities. In other words, even though they have only fallen behind because they have not received high-quality instruction, schools believe incorrectly that they may have a learning or other disability. 91 These school placement and resource allocation decisions matter for student achievement and post-K-12 school outcomes. 192 Severe funding disparities between schools serving white students and those serving black students persist as well. 193 Many school districts across the country today continue to be funded primarily by property taxes raised from the school district's local community, even though they continue to be segregated by race and income. Federal and state governments have not filled the gaps between high and low income districts. According to a study by EdBuild, nationally, predominantly white school districts get $23 billion more than their non-white peers, despite serving a similar number of children, and there is a $1,500 per student gap between white districts. And equally disadvantaged non-white districts. 194 This funding differential matters. More school funding improves education quality. 195 In underfunded schools, students also face health and other risks because of the decrepit conditions of their school buildings. 196 Discriminatory use of discipline and the school-to-prison track. Are disproportionately subjected to exclusionary discipline with devastating consequences, which include significantly higher risk of dropout and juvenile justice involvement. 197 Over the last 3 decades, research has shown that black students are far more likely than white students to be suspended, even when controlling for income level. 98 This disproportionate discipline also extends to preschool, where Department of Education data from the 2013-14 school year showed that black preschoolers made up 18% of preschoolers, but nearly half of all out-of-school suspensions. 99 Overall, black students made up approximately 16% of enrollment, yet they accounted for 4% of suspensions nationally during the 2013-14 school year. And black students were 4 times more likely to be suspended than their white peers during the 2017-18 school year. 201 Some researchers have shown that you control for the type of student misbehavior, black students are suspended and expelled at far higher rates than their white peers. Even when white students and black students misbehave in the same or similar ways, black students are more likely to be removed from school for the behavior than their white peers who do the same or similar things. 202 researchers have also found that the difference in suspension rates between white and black students accounts for as much as 1/5 of the achievement gap between black and white students, so if black students were suspended less, then achievement levels should go up. 203. Black students are more likely to attend schools with law enforcement on campus and significant security measures, such as metal detectors, random security sweeps and searches, security guards, and security cameras. 204. Having a large police presence and hated surveillance measures on campus can cause students to feel less bonded to school adults, less engaged in school, more fearful and less trusting of school officials and police. With a feeling of alienation because they perceive that adults on campus inherently distrust them. 205. Serving mostly black students have more law enforcement and fewer counselors is one reason that black students have more contact with and are also disproportionately referred by schools to law enforcement. Of black students are higher in schools with a police officer on campus, even when controlling for school-wide academic achievement, racial, ethnic composition, geography, and student misconduct. 206. In the 2015-16 school year, black students made up 15%. Enrolled in America's public schools, but 31% of referrals and arrests, and they were twice as likely to be referred or arrested than their white peers in 2018-19. 7. And black girls are 3 times more likely than white girls to receive referrals to law enforcement. 8. There is also evidence that black students are more likely to be subjected to excessive force by officers in schools. 109. One arrest during school can have severe consequences for a student's future, as it doubles a high school student's likelihood of dropout and increases their likelihood of incarceration as adults. 210. Proportionality in discipline, and the school-to-prison pipeline such disproportionality begets, has been attributed to biases, implicit or otherwise, that school officials may carry into the schoolhouse. Shows that these biases about black students, which can result in discriminatory disciplinary decisions, may also exacerbate the achievement gap by decreasing expectations and opportunities. 11. In addition, when students perceive an unfair distribution of punishment, an environment of anxiety is created, with achievement outcomes decreasing and students reporting less of a sense of belonging. 112. Consistent research has identified alternatives to exclusionary discipline, such as school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports and social-emotional learning lessons for students that improve educational outcomes, faculty cohesion, school safety, morale, but many school districts have not implemented these alternatives. 213. Furthermore, intergenerational exposure to trauma related to racism has been linked to higher incidences of depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions. Communities compared with other groups, including African immigrants, who have not experienced the same multi-generational slavery and institutionalized racism. 14. Schools have not consistently provided help, such as mental health services and a trauma-informed approach to education. Instead, schools with large numbers of black students have increased security and police presence. And white students and black students misbehave in similar ways, black students are more likely to be removed from schools. 20. Chapter 6. Separate and unequal education. Of the school-to-prison pipeline is also reflected in data over decades showing that, nationally, black youth and adults are incarcerated at a disproportionately high rate compared with white youth and adults. 15. See Chapter 11 An Unjust Legal System and Chapter 8 Pathologizing the Black Family for additional discussions of this topic. The system, education provided to black students in juvenile facilities is often substandard and youth in adult facilities may receive no education at all. 16. One of the many tragic consequences of the disproportionate incarceration of black men is reflected in the academic struggles experienced by young black boys. 17. The incarceration of black adult men contributes to the number of young black students in fatherless homes. Research suggests that the lack of male models in the home has a significantly higher impact on black male students than it does on black female students. 218. California. War until the present, African Americans attending school in California have been forced to endure the same segregated and unequal education conditions endured by African Americans in the rest of the nation. Years, school segregation was required by state law. The methods to maintain segregated and unequal schools, which included housing segregation, how to draw school districts, and where to build schools, have largely mirrored the methods employed in other states outside of the South. And unequal education systems. In 1866, California law was amended to empower school districts to allow colored children to attend school with white children in areas where there were not enough children of color to create a separate school. The majority of white parents objected in writing. 19. However, this change was short-lived because a California superintendent of public instruction who believed in segregation and a governor who refused to abide by the 14th and 15th Amendments won the subsequent election. 220. 70. Legislators amended California law to provide that every school shall be open for the admission of white children residing within the school district, and that the education of children of African descent and Indian children shall be provided for in separate schools. Schools with fewer than 10 students of color can educate them in separate schools or in any other manner. 21. The Oakland School Board interpreted state law as no longer requiring a school for black children and, in 1871, abruptly closed its colored school, which had been operating since 1866. 22. November 22, 1872, after the principal of San Francisco's white-only Broadway public school denied 11-year-old Mary Frances Ward entrance and told her to attend the separate, all-black public school, she and her parents filed suit in California court. 123. The California Supreme Court upheld the system of segregated schools with a caveat. 224. Where no separate school existed, the court concluded that black children could attend white schools. 225. Soon after, state law was conformed to the Ward decision. Children of African descent and Indian children must be educated in separate schools, but if districts fail to provide such separate schools, then such children must be admitted into schools for white children. 26. Revealed that in 1874, there were 23 colored schools in California, but conditions had worsened for many of the state's black youths because such schools were poorly equipped. 27. 1 year later, in 1875, the San Francisco School Board ended school segregation, principally due to the cost of maintaining segregated schools. 28. Soon after, in 1880, the legislature removed school segregation for black students from state education law. Amended law stated that schools must be open for all children, except children of filthy or vicious habits, or children suffering from contagious or infectious diseases. 29. Less. 10 years later, in 1890, 12-year-old Arthur Weisinger was denied admission to Visalia's Little White public school on account of race. The school for non-white Americans was manifestly unequal to the school for white Americans, as illustrated by the fact that the Visalia School District built a new 2-story school for white students and forced black students to attend school in a barn. 230. Weisinger's father, Edmund, both black and Native American, had been brought to California as an enslaved person during the gold rush and eventually bought his freedom. He became a part-time preacher and laborer and always stressed the value of education to his 6 children. Edmund wanted to send his son to Visalia's newly constructed school. However, officials said his son could only attend the one held in the barn. He sued in response, and the California Supreme Court ultimately held in favor of Edmund, but he died before he could see his son enroll in the Little White school. The court found that the 1880 law allowed a black student to attend any local public school. 231. However, the court also recognized the state legislature's right to reimpose segregated schools whenever it wished. 32. This decision, California continued to have racially segregated schools due to other discriminatory policies in housing and education. Just as education segregation existed in the North because of government-supported housing segregation, so too it existed in California. Supported housing discrimination in the form of restrictive covenants on properties, redlining, and white-only housing perpetuated school segregation. Federal government intentionally financed the creation of neighborhoods segregated by race, funding white-only public housing, redlining communities to deny homeownership loans to African Americans, and promoting racially restrictive housing covenants. Chapter 5. Housing segregation. For a more detailed discussion of this topic. Restrictive covenants, enforced by California courts until 1948, were inserted into property titles as early as the 1890s and became rampant in the 1910s, effectively turning neighborhoods across the state white only. 133 districts then assigned students to schools based on the segregated neighborhood where they lived or gerrymandered district boundaries to create segregated schools. Districts also zoned and constructed schools and drew school attendance boundaries in ways that created schools segregated by race. 234 in addition, in the 1940s and 1950s, when black homeowners tried to break the color lines, they came under attack by the Ku Klux Klan. March 2, 1945, 5 Mexican-American families on behalf of 5,000 other families sued the Westminster School District in Orange County because the school district forced their children to attend a different set of schools with fewer resources than the children of white families. 136 2 years later, the Federal Court of Appeal in California ruled that California education law did not permit separate schools for Mexican children, so creation of segregated schools for Mexican children was arbitrary and not allowed under federal law. 37 This case is called the Mendez case after the family who led the filing of the lawsuit. Of this lawsuit, most black students in the state were also attending schools with all black or nearly all black children. California law also did not permit the creation of separate schools for black students. This case meant that where a school district had purposefully created a segregated school by, for example, creating school attendance boundaries around a black neighborhood, was illegal. The lawyers who filed Brown versus Board of Education relied on the cases filed by Weisinger and Mendez and the other 4 Mexican-American families to help convince the Supreme Court to hold that separate schooling was unconstitutional. So, as a result of the Mendez decision, on June 14, 1947, the last of California's school segregation laws, which applied to Asian American and Native American children, was repealed. 38. After the Weisinger and Mendez decision, and the Brown decision in 1954, local cities and school boards refused to take proactive steps to desegregate schools. Example, they did not change the school site attendance boundaries that had been drawn to reflect racially segregated neighborhoods and that created racially segregated schools. So did not take proactive steps to allow students to attend other schools outside their racially segregated neighborhoods. Moreover, those that did, failed to provide black students adequate transportation to get them to schools in the white neighborhood. Years after, California leaders and the state's school board acknowledged that local school segregation continued and was illegal, but the problem was not fixed. In 1962, California's Board of Education acknowledged the ongoing problem of highly segregated schools and directed local districts to exert all effort to avoid and eliminate segregation. 239 in 1964, prominent civil rights attorney, Loren Miller, confirmed that rampant segregation by race existed in California schools when he told them, Western governors, or Negro children attend all Negro schools in Los Angeles than in Jackson, Mississippi and Little Rock, Arkansas, combined. 240. Racial school census data taken in 1966 also confirmed the high levels of segregated schools. 85% of African Americans attended predominantly minority schools, whereas only 12% of black students and 39% of white students attended racially balanced schools. 241 To address this segregation, California Attorney General Stanley Mosk advocated for explicit consideration of race in formulating a plan to eliminate it, because to ignore race one would have to, not merely conclude the Constitution is colorblind, but that it is totally blind. 242. School boards and districts did not take the necessary steps to integrate schools, and so Black and Latino families and their advocates filed lawsuits and asked California courts to order school districts to integrate. 43 In the 1960s and 70s, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Pasadena, San Diego, Inglewood, and Richmond school districts, among others, faced court desegregation orders. Berkeley and Riverside initiated busing programs. 244. Despite these orders, the passage of Proposition 64 in November 1964 allowed majority white California to undermine efforts to integrate schools through desegregation of communities. Proposition allowed property sellers, landlords, and agents to continue to segregate communities, and, thereby, schools, on racial grounds when selling or renting accommodations, as they had been permitted to do before 1963. 45. The highest courts ultimately struck the law down in 1967, but private racially restrictive covenants continued to be used by private owners to prevent African Americans from moving into white neighborhoods with better funded and resourced schools. 146. See Chapter 5, Housing Segregation for further discussion of related issues. Californians successfully passed laws to limit the tools courts could use to order schools to desegregate. Because neighborhoods continued to be segregated by race, one of the main tools that courts used to desegregate schools was to have black and white students attend schools outside of their neighborhoods via bus transportation to the new schools. White Californians strongly opposed integration plans, especially court-ordered ones that required black people or other students of color to be bused to attend their white schools or vice versa. In 1979, majority white Californians passed Proposition 1, a law that stopped ordering school desegregation plans, unless families or students suing to desegregate the schools could prove that intentional discrimination by school officials caused the segregation, or a federal court could impose the same order. 47. Upheld by the United States Supreme Court, limited the ability of California courts to integrate schools that were segregated in fact, for example due to racially segregated neighborhoods, but not by a California law. 148. Then, from the mid to late 1970s through the 1990s, courts removed or limited desegregation orders in many California districts, as the Supreme Court and Congress further restricted the use of remedies like busing and school reassignment to integrate schools. 49. In a few cases, such as in Berkeley, schools remained relatively integrated because school districts continued busing students and using school selection processes designed to achieve integration, even without a desegregation order. 50. In the vast majority of California school districts, schools either resegregated or were never integrated, and so segregated schooling persists today. As of 2003, California was one of the 4 most segregated states for black students. 151. As of 2014, California was identified as the 3rd most segregated state for black students, and a state where black and Latino students are strongly concentrated in schools that have far lower quality and resources than their white and Asian peers. 52. As of 2020, California remained in the top 10 most segregated states for black students. 253. Approximately 51% of black students in California attend hyper-segregated, 90 to 100% non-white schools. 254. American children and teacher in classroom studying corn and cotton, Annie Davis School, near Tuskegee, Alabama. Circa 1902. Courtesy of Francis Benjamin Johnston, Library of Congress. 123. Unequal education. Case, the state found that the segregation that persisted in a Bay Area school district was by design. For example, the California Attorney General's office found in 2019 that the Sausalito Marin City School Board had segregated its schools. The vast majority of black students in an underfunded and under-resourced school while providing a better funded and resourced charter school for the majority of white students. 255. Separate and unequal education conditions persist. California's highly segregated schools, schools mostly attended by white and Asian children receive more funding and resources than schools mostly attended by black and Latino children. Throughout the 20th century, school districts in California, like those across the nation, finance their operations mainly with local property tax revenue and limited amounts of state and federal funding. Allowed richer, white neighborhoods to better fund their schools districts than poorer black neighborhoods. 256. In 1971, the California Supreme Court decided that this education funding system was discriminatory because, according to the Supreme Court, it made the quality of a child's education a function of the wealth of his parents and neighbors. 257. 1978, voters passed Proposition 13, which decreased the amount of local property tax revenues and increased the amount of state funding for K-12 education. 88. Voters then approved Proposition 98, which requires the state to dedicate at least 40% of its general fund to K-14 education each year. 258. These measures still did not solve the issue, and black parents and other parents and students of color have continued to challenge funding inequities in court. In late April 1991, the The Richmond Unified School District, which served a high proportion of black students, announced that it would close its schools 6 weeks early on May 1, 1991 due to a budget shortfall. In Chapter 5, Housing Segregation, Federal Housing Policies, and Local Officials segregated Richmond and made it extremely difficult for black residents to move to the suburbs after World War II. 159 Richmond parents sued, and the state Supreme Court decided that the closure did not meet the minimum level of education required by the state constitution. 60 in the late 1990s, in the Compton Unified School District, which served mostly black and Latino students, a teacher described the deplorable conditions in a temporary school building in Compton where she taught, because the wooden across the ceiling were being eaten by termites. A fine layer of wood dust covered the students' desks every morning. Crawled in a cracked and collapsing area of the floor near my desk. The blue metal window coverings on the outsides of the windows were shut permanently, blocking all sunlight. 61. 2000, students were part of a lawsuit, Williams versus California, again alleging that schools serving majority black, Latino, and low-income students across the state failed to provide access to even the most rudimentary learning tools, school books, safe and decent facilities. By teachers. 262. The lawsuit ultimately settled. 2004. With $138 million in state funds to provide instructional materials to schools, $800 million for facility repairs in low-performing schools through establishment of the Emergency Repair Program (ERP), $80 million to create a complaint and oversight system to check to see if schools were providing the basics of an education. 63. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, which brought the lawsuit, the state has failed its obligation under the settlement to fund the ERP, and, as of 2013, the state's cumulative net contribution to ERP for the 5 last years had been $0. 64. Further, despite progress made as a result of the Williams settlement, persistent challenges remain, such as textbook distribution issues and insufficient monitoring of school districts that are new to the Williams process. 65. Without county oversight, school districts facing hard fiscal choices are often tempted to give textbooks less of a priority, despite the fact that, under Williams, students have a right to sufficient instructional materials. 66. California's unequal funding system continues to mean that black and Latino students, and low-income students have far fewer school resources. 2013, the state tried to address the inequalities in school funding by giving more money to schools that have higher numbers of low-income, homeless, and foster youth. In the way funding was provided to school districts is referred to as the Equity Index, and is part of the state's local control funding formula that provides approximately 58% of the funding that California public schools receive each year. 267. 20. California remained in the top 10 most segregated states in the country for black students. Approximately 64% of black students in California attend hyper-segregated, 90 to 100% non-white schools. 24. 6. An unequal education. State's funding formula does not focus on black students specifically or require schools to ensure that the funding is spent on the high-needs students within the district. 68. Because about 32% of the funding for California schools still comes from local property taxes, and wealthier communities with higher property values can more easily raise additional funds through local bonds and donations. And often more predominantly white neighborhoods continue to fund their schools at greater levels. 269. October 2021 Task Force hearing. Kawika Smith, who graduated from Verbum Dei High School in Watts, a historic black neighborhood of Los Angeles, testified about 2 high schools in Los Angeles. Predominantly black high school, black students went without paper for 3 months simply because the school was underfunded. In contrast, the other school had access to extra funding, which allowed the school to purchase a fountain. Told the task force, "I strongly believe that we need to revisit the property tax laws and algorithms for how schools are funded. Imagine if that money was redirected into the black school where they needed the money, what that could have meant for black students." 270. To the country, unequal funding translates to unequal opportunities. With fewer resources mean fewer advanced placement and college preparation courses, which means that black students attending those schools are less competitive for college and university admission and may not have taken the courses. called AG courses in California, to go to a 4-year state university. Districts and schools, black students continue to be placed in vocational tracks and out of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and advanced placement programs. 71. In addition, black students in California are disproportionately likely to be identified as having a learning disability, at nearly twice the rate of black students nationwide. 72. Where we failed is discontinuing those efforts to integrate our schools, to invest in them equitably, and to begin in the pre-K years. Dr. Rucker Johnson, professor of public policy at Berkeley, told the Task Force 273. Studies have shown the importance of having at least one teacher who looks like you. 74. But the percentage of black teachers in California declined from 5.1% in 1997-98 to 4% in 2017-18, even though black students made up 5.6% of California's student population. 75. Black men comprise 1% of California's teaching force. 76. In California, while suspensions have decreased significantly statewide since 2013, 277 black students continue to be suspended at 3 times the rate of white students. 78. And lose nearly 4 times the number of days of instruction to suspensions and expulsions as white students. 279 suspensions for subjective offenses, such as willful defiance or disruption, which can include anything from failing to take a hat off in class to talking in class, are a persistent but declining source of disproportionate discipline due to recent legislation limiting use for these reasons. Stipulated judgments reached with 4 different California school districts. The California Attorney General's office identified racial disparities in discipline for black students with harmful negative impacts. 80. For example, the Attorney General's investigation of the Barstow Unified School District found that black middle and high school students were 79 and 78%, respectively, more likely to be suspended out of school than similarly situated white students. Days black students were punished was 168% greater in elementary, 37.9% greater in middle school, and 54.5% greater in high school than their white peers. 81. California, black students are also disproportionately referred by schools to law enforcement. 82. A case investigated by the California Attorney General's office found that, since 1991, school resource officers in the Stockton Unified School District had arrested 34,000 students, including 1,600 under 10 years old, with many minor misbehaviors turned into criminal offenses. Proportionality impacting black and Latino students, and students with disabilities. 283. High-profile reported cases have also raised concerns that black children in California face increased risk of invasive searches and excessive use of force in schools. Reported case. During school hours, a officer handcuffed a 5-year-old black boy with zip ties and charged him with battery because he resisted being arrested. 84. The American Civil Liberties Union has also reported a number of incidents. 1. A black student in a Los Angeles school was partially strip-searched in the presence of a male officer. A vice principal forced an 8th grade girl to pull her bra away from her body and shake it, and when she tried to cover her breast for modesty, the vice principal pulled her hands away. 185. In another filed case, school police were alleged to have handcuffed and placed a 13-year-old black student on probation after he was playing a makeshift game of soccer with an orange. 186. In yet another, the American Civil Liberties Union reported that a school police officer who told a black high school student that it was wrong to be gay and wear boys' clothes pushed her against the wall and handcuffed her for telling the officer that it was also wrong that white people like the officer enslaved her people. 187. Subsequent to the incident, the same officer continued to harass her, routinely patting her down and demanding that she turn out her bag. 88. Jacob Black Jackson, the Los Angeles Youth Commissioner. The task force during its October 2021 hearing how he was placed in an abusive adoptive home and lost his older brother in a police shooting but was focused on finishing high school at Crenshaw High and passing all of his classes. 89. When, at school, Jackson made a mistake in dealing with a substitute teacher, instead of the teacher, counselors, and school administrators trying to work with him, he was questioned, threatened by school police for an incident he had already apologized for. The school police officer told Jackson that, "They would always be watching me. You're just like everybody else at this school. ... Scared and anxious and unclear about what to do. Felt he could not stay at his high school and told the task force that, what I wish the school had provided for me when I was there was real counselors, after-school programs, real nurses, black people history, peace building, and transformative justice practice." Research shows that school officials are more likely to refer black students like Jackson to law enforcement for minor behavior than white students. Such contacts with law enforcement increase a student's feeling of isolation, and contributes to the school-to-prison pipeline and the disproportionate rates of black people in our criminal justice system. 91. Juvenile justice system. Black students face an increased likelihood of dropout due to inconsistent education access and adequacy of instruction. 92. See Chapter 11 An Unjust Legal System for a more detailed discussion of this topic. Black students charged with offenses that result in a transfer to the state prison system, few can access and complete higher education. 93. 32% of the funding for California schools still comes from local property taxes, and wealthier communities with higher property values can more easily raise additional funds through local bonds and donations. And often more predominantly white neighborhoods continue to fund their schools at greater levels.